They sold the only home I grew up in to fund my brother's failing business. 6 months later, they showed up at my doorstep with suitcases, smiling like nothing had happened. For 37 years, I believed family meant love, loyalty, and sacrifice, until I realized the sacrifice was always mine. That night, I lay awake replaying every emergency they'd dragged me into, every dollar they'd taken without a second thought. I could either let them move in or let them meet the new version of me, one with evidence, allies, and a plan they would never see coming. The phone rang at 2:07 a.m., its shrill sound slicing through the dark silence of my bedroom. I fumbled for it, my heart already racing because calls at that hour were never good news. "Rebecca," my mother's voice came through, breathless, as though she'd been crying or rehearsing. "We sold the house. Your brother's business needed the money. It's all gone now, but don't worry. We'll be staying with you for a while, just until we figure things out." I sat up, clutching the phone to my ear, the sheets pooling around my waist. "You sold the house?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. That house wasn't just brick and wood. It was the place I'd grown up, the only home that had ever felt permanent. I could still picture the creak in the third stair, the smell of cinnamon rolls drifting from the kitchen on Saturday mornings. "Why didn't you call me before making such a decision?" She sighed as though I were being unreasonable. "It was urgent. Your brother was in trouble. You understand family comes first, right?" My pulse quickened, heat blooming in my chest. Family. That word had been used my entire life as a command, not a comfort. I swallowed hard. "And you want to move in here? For how long?" "Oh, just a few months," she said lightly, too lightly. "We'll help with groceries, pitch in here and there." I almost laughed at that. In 37 years, they had never pitched in for anything, but I bit my tongue because the alternative was a fight I wasn't ready to have at 2 a.m. "Rebecca," she added, voice dropping to a near whisper, "everything is already prepared." The line went dead before I could ask what that meant. I sat there in the darkness, staring at the phone in my hand, the words looping in my head. Already prepared. Morning came with the metallic taste of a sleepless night still in my mouth. I went through the motions, coffee, shower, answering work emails, trying to convince myself that maybe I was overthinking. Maybe everything is already prepared, just meant they'd packed bags. But that unease lodged in my chest refused to fade. It was mid-morning when the email landed in my inbox. At first, I thought it was a work message. The subject line read, "Final Timeline." It wasn't addressed to me, but to my brother, with my mother copied in. It took me a second to realize it had been forwarded by accident. I opened it, my stomach tightening with every word. The message was dated 6 months ago, 6 months. It outlined in chilling detail the plan to sell the house, transfer the funds, and move into my home. There was even a note about managing Rebecca's reaction and reminding her of everything we've done for her, as if my life was some balance sheet they could manipulate. I stared at the lines until they blurred. 6 months. They had been planning this for half a year, and not once had they thought to tell me. Instead, they'd decided to stage it as a last-minute crisis, counting on my guilt to make me fold. I leaned back in my chair, the room spinning. My mind drifted, unbidden, to memories of being 10 years old and handing over my birthday money so Dad could cover a bill. Of skipping school trips so my brother could have new cleats for soccer. of standing in the cold outside the hospital with coffee for Mom when she forgot her coat. Back then, it hadn't felt like sacrifice. It had felt like love. But love, I was realizing, wasn't supposed to be a constant transaction. I scrolled further down the email, my eyes catching on one line near the bottom. Once she signs, we can proceed without issue. My breath caught. Signs what? There was no attachment, no explanation, just that ominous sentence dangling like a hook in my brain. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, but the words stayed, echoing, once she signs. I didn't know yet what they were planning, but one thing was certain. They'd underestimated me. The restaurant was warm, buzzing with the chatter of my friends and family as candles flickered across the tables. I'd agreed to this birthday dinner because my mother had insisted it would be low-key. I should have known better. Halfway through the main course, she stood up, clinking her glass with a spoon. "Everyone, may I have your attention?" she began, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to be applauded. "As you know, our house is gone, and we've been through a lot. But we're so blessed to have Rebecca, who has opened her home to us, indefinitely." The word hit me like a brick. Indefinitely. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Around the table, heads turned toward me, nodding in approval, as if I'd just announced it myself. Before I could speak, another voice cut through the room, familiar, unwelcome. "Well, that's no surprise," he said with a smirk. My ex-boyfriend, Michael, stepped forward from the back of the room, holding a wine glass. I hadn't seen him in years. "Rebecca's always been the generous one. Remember when she paid my rent for 3 months after I lost my job? She's a giver." It wasn't gratitude in his tone. It was smugness, the satisfaction of airing something personal in front of an audience. A ripple of whispers spread through the guests. My parents beamed, as though Michael had just proven their point. Heat rose up my neck, and for a moment I thought I might actually leave. But then I saw him, an older man I didn't recognize, standing near the door, watching me intently. When our eyes met, he gave the smallest nod, as if confirming something to himself. As people began clapping for my generosity, I slipped away from the table, weaving between chairs, until I was close enough to hear him speak. His voice was low, urgent. "I think you should know the truth about your brother," he said. My breath caught, but before I could respond, a waiter passed between us, and the man was gone, leaving only the faint smell of aftershave in the air. I didn't go back to the table. Instead, I found my coat, my bag, and walked straight out into the cold night. In the quiet of my car, I gripped the steering wheel, my hands trembling. I replayed the evening, my mother's announcement, Michael's smug smile, the stranger's words. The anger was there, yes, but beneath it was something sharper, clarity. They'd counted on me to react, to shout or cry, to make a scene they could twist into proof that I was unstable. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. The frost on the windshield blurred the streetlights into soft halos as I sat there, breathing slowly, forcing my pulse to calm. My hands were still unsteady, but my mind was beginning to sharpen. My phone buzzed in my lap, an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I opened it. A single image filled the screen. My brother, seated at a desk, signing a document. The angle was slightly tilted, as if taken discreetly from a distance. The paper in front of him was clear enough to read. A loan agreement, my name printed neatly at the top as the guarantor. I stared at it, my stomach twisting into knots. He was already dragging me into his mess, not just morally, but legally. The signature line under my name was still blank in the photo. For now. A second later, another message appeared beneath the image. You don't have much time. I sat there, the cold seeping in around me, my breath visible in the air. Outside, people walked past, laughing, carrying bags of leftovers, unaware that my life had just shifted on its axis. The engine idled, a low hum against the silence, but I didn't move. The stranger from the party knew things I needed to know. And whatever this was, it was bigger than my parents' plan to move in. I didn't know yet how I was going to fight back. But for the first time, I knew with absolute certainty that I would. The next morning, I bought 2 small discrete cameras. Models meant for monitoring pets or babysitters, not parents. I placed one in the living room, angled toward the couch where my parents always sat to talk. The other went in the kitchen, tucked between cookbooks on a high shelf. The feed streamed directly to my phone, and I told myself this wasn't about spying, it was about survival. By the second day, I had my first recording. The living room feed caught my father shuffling through envelopes while my mother leaned close. She still hasn't closed that joint account, my mother whispered. We just need to time it right. My father's voice was low, almost bored. The bank needs both signatures if she's distracted. Or if we have the key, my mother cut in. There was a pause, then the faint sound of papers being folded. The key to what? My father asked. The lockbox. You know she keeps important things there. Once we have it, everything else falls into place. The conversation ended abruptly when the front door opened and my brother's voice boomed in the background. I replayed the audio, my stomach tightening at the phrase, the key. I had no idea what lockbox she meant, but it was clear they believed it held something valuable enough to anchor their entire plan. That night, I reached out to people I could trust. My Aunt Clara was first, my mother's older sister, a woman who had distanced herself from the family years ago. When I explained what I'd discovered, she didn't sound surprised. They've done this before, Rebecca, she said softly. Not to you, but to me. That's why I cut ties. I just never thought they'd turn it on their own daughter. Her voice cracked, and for a moment we were silent together, the weight of shared betrayal pressing down. Next was Aaron, a cybersecurity specialist I'd met through work, a so-called white hat hacker. I sent him the audio, explaining I needed more than just my recordings. I wanted the full picture, emails, hidden files, anything that could prove intent. Within hours, he called back. I can try to access your dad's old computer. You said it's in the garage? Bring it to me. If they used it for planning, they might have left a trail. Finally, I spoke to Daniel, my lawyer. He was blunt. If they're using your name for financial agreements, you need documentation, dates, amounts, signatures. Without proof, it's your word against theirs. By the end of the week, my allies were in motion. Aunt Clara offered to keep copies of every file I collected. Aaron began combing through the old desktop, and Daniel drafted letters to my bank to restrict account access. In the middle of all this, I had one unexpected offer of help. Mrs. Green, my next-door neighbor, a retired school teacher who'd lived in the same house for 40 years. When I mentioned my concerns, she told me her outdoor security cameras covered part of my driveway and front porch. If they've been moving things in without your knowledge, she said, you'll see it here. It was a quiet evening when Aaron called again. "Rebecca, you'll want to see this in person." I drove to his apartment, my pulse quickening. On his screen was a folder labeled Legacy, buried deep in the hard drive of my father's computer. Inside were scanned documents, bank statements, property deeds, and one file that made my chest tighten. It was a will, not my father's, but my grandmother's. The date was 10 years old, long before she passed. The final page was clear. She had left her home, the one my parents had sold, to me, along with a significant savings account. Aaron leaned back in his chair. "If this is valid, and they sold the property without your consent..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was heavy in the air. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, my mind already leaping ahead to what this meant. My parents hadn't just manipulated me, they might have broken the law. The last line of the document burned into my mind. "To my granddaughter, Rebecca Carter, in gratitude for her care and love." Snow drifted lazily through the cold night air as guests filed into my home, the air rich with the scent of cinnamon and pine. I'd told them it was a Christmas charity party, a chance to raise money for the local shelter. The truth was far less festive. Among the guests were cousins, old family friends, and a handful of local reporters I'd met through a work project. Every invitation had been intentional. I moved through the room, smiling, offering drinks, all the while aware of my parents and brother in the corner, chatting as if nothing in the world were amiss. When everyone had arrived, I stepped onto the small platform near the fireplace and tapped the microphone. "Before we begin tonight's charity raffle," I said, my voice steady, "I want to share something important with you all." The TV mounted above the mantel flickered to life. First came the audio recording of my parents discussing the joint account and the key. Gasps rippled through the room. Then photographs, my brother signing the loan agreement in my name, the email mapping out the plan to move in, and finally the scanned will from my grandmother. Murmurs rose into sharp whispers. My father's face had gone pale. My mother's lips pressed into a tight line. The reporters scribbled notes. "This," I continued, "is what my family has been doing for months. Selling a home that wasn't theirs to sell. Using my name for debts I never agreed to. Planning to take more." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the creak of the floorboard as my brother rose to his feet. His voice was louder than necessary, defensive. All of this, every single thing, was because she forced me into it. The words hung in the air like a blade. I didn't flinch. Instead, I tilted my head slightly, my tone calm. "Forced you? How exactly did I do that?" He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. You always had more. You wouldn't help unless..." He stumbled over his words, then snapped. "You think you're perfect, but you made it impossible for me to succeed without committing fraud?" I asked gently. The room was utterly still. He faltered, the flush creeping up his neck. "It wasn't fraud, it was using my signature without permission," I finished. "Is that what you're saying?" The reporters' pens scratched faster. Somewhere near the back, a relative I barely knew stood up. "They did the same to me 20 years ago," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "Promised to pay me back, ruined my credit instead. I never told anyone because I thought it was just me." The air shifted, turning against my parents. My mother's eyes darted from face to face, searching for an ally and finding none. My father opened his mouth, but before he could speak, another guest whispered something about loan sharks and debt collectors. It was my brother who broke. Fine, he spat. Yes, they borrowed from people you don't mess with. It's why we needed the money fast. The words landed like gunfire. My parents stared at him, stunned, as though betrayal wasn't something they understood could happen to them. I let the silence swell before stepping down from the platform. My part was over. The truth was in the open, and it was theirs to choke on. The living room felt too hot, too full of eyes. I slipped out onto the balcony, the cold air biting at my cheeks. My hands gripped the railing, breath rising in white clouds. For a moment, I just let the tears fall, not from regret, but from the weight of years of manipulation lifting at once. Behind me, the murmur of voices was muffled by the glass door. Inside, the people who had tried to corner me were now cornered themselves. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a message from my lawyer. Instead, the screen showed an unknown number. 4 words. It's not over yet. The days after the Christmas party moved quickly. My lawyer, Daniel, wasted no time sending a formal demand letter to my parents. Vacate the premises within 30 days or face legal eviction. The language was sharp, unflinching, leaving no room for misinterpretation. My brother received a separate notice, one detailing the lawsuit for document fraud, complete with copies of the loan agreement, bearing my forged signature. I half expected them to show up at my door, shouting or crying, but instead I got silence. It was almost worse. The only sound in my house those weeks was the ticking clock and the rustle of legal paperwork as I signed page after page. When the 30 days expired, they left without a word. My neighbors told me the moving truck came early in the morning, and by noon, the house was empty. I stood at the window, watching the driveway where their car used to sit. There was no triumph in it, just a hollow kind of relief. The court date for my brother's case came soon after. I sat in the gallery as the evidence was read aloud. The recordings, the photographs, the loan documents. He avoided my gaze the entire time, his shoulders hunched, his voice small, when he finally admitted to signing without my consent. It was over in less than an hour, the verdict clear, guilty. The judge's gavel struck, and I felt the tightness in my chest begin to loosen. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about proof, about reclaiming my name. For the first time in months, I felt clean. As I stepped out of the courthouse, Daniel fell into step beside me. "There's one more thing," he said, holding out an envelope. "A wire transfer is being processed into your account. It's substantial." I stopped on the courthouse steps. "From who?" He smiled faintly. "That's the part you'll want to hear in person." The next morning we sat in his office, the winter sun slanting through the blinds. He handed me a file and gestured for me to open it. Inside was a certified copy of my grandmother's will, the same one Erin had found on my father's computer, but now verified by the probate court. "She left you her home," Daniel said, "and a sizable savings account. The sale of that property, done without your consent, entitles you to the full value. The funds are being transferred now." I traced my finger over her signature, the familiar loops of her handwriting. She really meant it to be mine. Daniel leaned back. "There's more. Do you remember the man at your birthday party? The one who approached you?" I nodded. "He's the executor of your grandmother's estate, her personal lawyer. He's been keeping an eye on you for years, per her request, to make sure you were okay. When he heard what happened, he came forward. The revelations sat between us, warm and steady. All this time, I'd thought I was alone in the fight. I hadn't been. Later that week, I drove to the cemetery. The ground was frozen, the headstones dusted with snow. I knelt by my grandmother's grave, brushing away a thin layer of ice from her name. "Thank you," I whispered, "for believing in me when no one else did, for protecting me even after you were gone." The wind stirred, cold against my cheeks, and for a moment, I let myself believe it was her way of answering. I left the cemetery with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The money, the house, they were symbols, not solutions. The real gift was knowing I'd survived, that I could start again without their shadow over me. That evening, I was making tea when my phone buzzed with a news alert. I tapped the screen, and there it was. A headline splashed across the local paper's website. "Local woman exposes family fraud, inspires community." My photo from the courthouse was paired with quotes from people I didn't even know, calling me brave, resilient, a role model. I stared at the screen, a strange mix of pride and disbelief washing over me. Cutting my brother out of my life was easier than I expected. There was no grand confrontation, no tearful goodbye, just silence. I blocked his number, his email, even the social media accounts he used to post vague jabs in my direction. When his name came up in conversation, I redirected or excused myself. For my parents, the separation was more deliberate. Every communication went through Daniel, my lawyer. If they wanted to send me something, it was mailed to his office. If they wanted to speak to me, he spoke for me. The absence of their voices was startling at first, like the ringing in your ears after a loud concert. But as weeks passed, that silence became peace. With the settlement money transferred and my finances secured, I bought a house across town. A place no one in my family had ever been to. It wasn't enormous, but it was mine. The first thing I did after signing the deed was change every lock and install a security system Aaron had personally vetted. I changed my phone number, set up a P.O. box, and stripped my online presence of personal details. My life became a fortress, not just in brick and steel, but in boundaries. The first morning in my new home, I sat by the wide kitchen window, a mug of coffee warming my hands. Outside, frost clung to the edges of the grass, and sunlight crept lazily over the rooftops. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was bracing for something to happen. My shoulders weren't tense. My phone wasn't buzzing with emergencies that weren't mine to solve. I just sat there, breathing, existing, knowing that the peace I felt had been earned. In the quiet, I thought about how many people must be living in the storm I had just escaped. People who didn't yet realize they could leave it. That thought stayed with me, tugging at me until one afternoon I opened my laptop and began to record my voice. The first episode of my podcast was raw, unpolished. I called it Cutting the Cord, Stories of Freedom from Toxic Family. I spoke about my childhood, my mistakes, the guilt I carried for years. I described the night of the Christmas party, the moment the truth came out, and how I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I didn't name names or reveal details that could hurt innocent people, but I was brutally honest about the patterns of manipulation, the tactics of control, and how to break free. To my surprise, people listened. Within a month, I had emails from strangers, some from my own city, others from countries I'd never visited, sharing their stories of survival. They thanked me for saying the words they couldn't yet speak. By the third month, the podcast had tens of thousands of downloads. An editor from a publishing house reached out, asking if I'd consider writing a book. "Your story," she said over the phone, "isn't just personal, it's universal. People need to know they're not alone." Writing wasn't something I'd planned, but once I began, the words poured out. Every chapter felt like closing a door I'd been afraid to shut. The book wasn't just about my family, it was about reclaiming your identity when the people closest to you try to erase it. One evening, after finishing a draft, I checked my email. Among the usual messages was one with the subject line, "You saved me." I opened it to find a long letter from a woman named Laura. She wrote about how she'd been caring for her parents financially for years, enduring constant criticism and emotional blackmail. She'd stumbled on my podcast while searching for family manipulation and listened to every episode in a single weekend. "I realized I'm not crazy and I'm not selfish," she wrote. "I told my parents I won't be giving them money anymore. I feel terrified, but I also feel free. You gave me the courage to do this. Your story saved me." I read her email 3 times, my throat tightening. It wasn't just about my own survival anymore. It was about creating a path for someone else to follow out of the dark. I replied to Laura, telling her I was proud of her, reminding her that fear fades and freedom expands. After I hit send, I sat back, staring at the blinking cursor on my screen. I thought about the me from a year ago, the woman who woke up at 2 a.m. to a phone call that would change everything, who bit her tongue at her birthday dinner, who sat in her car with trembling hands. I wished I could tell her then what I knew now, that she wouldn't just survive, she'd thrive. I closed my email and opened a new document. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I smiled, feeling the quiet strength in my chest. Slowly, deliberately, I typed the words, Chapter 1.